Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the RTX 3070. We took a look at it in the previous video and found that it still offers surprising performance at 1440p in 2026. Now because this is available on used selling sites for less than the cost of a new RTX 5060, I thought we'd compare the two today. Both of these cards have 8 gigs of VRAM, and if you're after a GPU for that new system build, well, it's not impossible that you end up trying to decide between these two, given that they both come in at the sub £300 or dollar price point, especially if you are shopping on the second-hand market. So of course the 5060 is over 4 years newer. It's more power efficient, it supports frame generation and PCIe 5.0, albeit with 8 PCIe lanes. The 3070 is older, runs in PCIe 4 mode, but we can still make use of the latest DLSS version 4.5, which we showcased in the previous video. We're ignoring all that today though, and we're just testing these side by side at native 1440p resolution in a handful of my favourite games, just to see how these two stack up. As I said, we're leaving frame gen and DLSS off the table today and just taking a look at how these games perform natively at 1440p with decent visual settings. So we'll start off with Cyberpunk 2077. I chose the high preset here. The crowd density was also set to high, as was the texture quality option. Now the 3070 is going to hit at least 70 frames per second, 77 overall with a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 49. The 5060, also an 8GB card, albeit with GDDR7 instead of GDDR6, hit 82 frames per second, and it did so while consuming a lot less power, as you can see from the on-screen statistics. We saw 82 as an average, so a few frames more, a 1% low of 63 and a 0.1% low of 51. So it was a pretty close result to start with here, but the 5060 pulled ever so slightly ahead. As we move on to GTA 5, it's worth stating that both of these cards are capable of solid 1440p gaming, as I think we proved in the last 3070 video, and hopefully we can showcase here as well. Despite 8 gigs of VRAM sounding like a limitation on paper, and don't get me wrong, it is in certain titles, especially if you try and crank the settings way up. So with GTA 5 Enhanced, we have the high RT or ray tracing preset. I also turned ray traced global illuminations on, and we're also using TAA here. This was another very close result, with the 3070 pulling in 117 frames per second on average, a 1% low of 95 and a 0.1% low of 73. The 5060 hit 120 FPS, so 3 frames more on average, though the 1% low was pretty much the same, 95 FPS. That said, the 0.1% figure was noticeably higher, 83, so it was certainly a slightly more consistent experience with the newer GPU, which of course runs with a far newer architecture. For Forza Horizon 5, I'm using the Extreme preset and TAA. It's worth mentioning that for my test rig today, if you haven't noticed it already of course, features the Ryzen 5 7500F, a 6-core 12-thread AM5 CPU that actually does a very good job of allowing both of these graphics cards to reach their maximum potential. It's an excellent choice in 2026, though it is let down a bit of course by the current memory prices, so you may want to consider a DDR4 chip instead. That said, we'll try and stay focused on the GPU side of things today, and for Forza Horizon 5 we have the RTX 3070 with 88 frames per second on average, a 1% low of 73 and a 0.1% low of 63. The 5060 hit 93 frames per second with a 1% low of 75 and a 0.1% low of 70, so the results were improved across the board, and as a result of the increased 0.1% figure, the game felt a little smoother, not just in the benchmark run but to actually play, though without the on-screen figures I don't think you'd be able to tell a difference, at least between the average numbers. Marvel Rivals now has a pretty intensive built-in benchmark, and that's what I decided to use in some of the games. If they had a decent benchmark, then I'd use that. If not, I'd just run my own benchmark. Like at Cyberpunk, the benchmark takes place mostly inside, so I thought I'd set a custom benchmark. But in games like Marvel Rivals here, there's a lot of on-screen action, so it gives you a good idea as to how the game will perform in those intense scenarios. So with the medium preset at 1440p here, we have screen space reflections enabled too, as well as screen space global illumination for 74 FPS on the 3070. This result was shared by the 5060, 74 frames per second yet again. The 1.1% lows were also very close, with the 3070 hitting 54, the 5060 hitting 56, and both cards coming in with the same 0.1% low of 48. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 up next at 1440p. Of course, some games, including this one tested today, don't feature a built-in benchmark at all, so we have to test the gameplay here. And during my little walk around town, we saw 78 frames per second with the high preset and SMAA2TX when using the 3070. The 1% low was 68 and the 0.1% low was 38. There was like a slight spike in performance, but that was basically it. It did, however, impact our 0.1% figure. This didn't occur during the same benchmark run with the 5060. Now, I repeated this route a couple of times and the same thing occurred. So with the 5060, the same average, 69, very nice, was that 1% low, so a very slight increase, but our 0.1% low was 65. For Baldur's Gate 3, we have the Ultra preset and TAA for 99 FPS with the 3070, and the same goes for the 5060, 99 frames per second on average. This time around, the 1% low was better, with the 3070 70 compared to 67, and the 0.1% figure swayed back in the favour of the 5060, 51 compared to 50, though this is really within margin of error territory and totally negligible when you're actually playing. You're not going to feel this difference, though the same can be said for all of these figures, the average, the 1% low and the 0.1% low. If we didn't have the on-screen performance stats, you wouldn't be able to tell a difference. Red Dead Redemption 2 is our penultimate game here at 1440p with the ultra textures and everything else set to high. That includes TAA. With the 3070 we saw 75 FPS, a 1% low of 63 FPS and a 0.1% low of 59, so a very smooth and consistent experience here. The 5060 hit 80 frames per second with a 1% low of 68 and a 0.1% low of 58, so again a very good result from this card, though the newer GPU pulled slightly ahead in this case. We'll finalise with Arc Raiders at the high preset with TSR, and this time around the 3070 actually came out in front with 82 frames per second with a 1% low of 69, very nice, and a 0.1% low of 52. This is compared to the 80 frames per second with the 5060, a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 61. So although the 1% and average figures were better with the 3070, the 5060 represents a slightly more consistent experience thanks to the increase in that 0.1% low frame rate. From the games I've tested today, the 5060 is going to be victorious most of the time, but considering the 3070 can often be found for quite a bit cheaper, well, I still think it's certainly worth considering, while the 5060 is newer, more power efficient, and of course can make use of frame gen, if you wish to use that of course. In terms of raw gaming performance at native resolution, it's a pretty close fight. And I hope this has made for an interesting and perhaps helpful comparison. Let me know your thoughts down below, as always, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.